part 4 of Puppets of Pandemonium. An article from You Are Being Lied To, edited by Russ Kick. It's not enough to invent something fantastic. You have to promote it. A 19th century Floridian, John Gorey, trying to keep the town of Apalachicola's population from contracting a fever that racked the multitudes every summer. In 1850, Gorey invented refrigeration and air conditioning. Alas, the clever tinkerer was better at inventing than at promoting his invention. He was blind to the necessity of creating a climate of belief that gets all the members of a skittish herd moving in the same direction. They are frightened at the thought of finding merit in something they might be ridiculed for championing. Gorey and his air conditioners were ridiculed by no less an authority than the writers of the New York Times, the lead animals in the herd. So a man whose gizmos could have improved many a Southerner's life died in abject poverty. Air conditioning and refrigeration were denied to mankind until a German inventor more skillful at manipulating the perceptions of the herd came along. Charles Darwin was far less naive than Gorey. He didn't just theorize and marshal evidence, then leave it at that. Darwin marshaled support, working hard to line up the backing of the top scientists of his day. Darwin already had one herd head turner going for him. His family was scientifically illustrious. The famous evolutionary theorist Erasmus Darwin was his grandfather. Anything with the Darwin name on it had an automatic attraction for the scientific sheep of the day. Yet Darwin worked methodically to court the friendship of scientific opinion makers. When Alfred Russel Wallace showed up in England, having already written up ideas Darwin had only penciled in, Darwin's influential friends lined up to support Chuck's prior claim to the concepts. They turned down the claims of Wallace, a stranger to them. When Darwin finally published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection in 1859, he relied on another friend, the famous T.H. Huxley, to publicize his ideas. Said Huxley, "I am sharpening up my claws and beak in readiness." Darwin kept a list of the men he'd have to win over, and methodically checked off each one he was able to convert. The father of evolution knew that science is more than a struggle for truth. It's a struggle for social influence, a game of manipulating the herd. Dante was equally savvy. He became known as a great poet through unabashed self-promotion. 13th century poets were poor, anonymous creatures. But Dante Alighieri lusted after the kind of fame poets had in the long-lost days of Rome. So he wrote a poem of epic proportions and made himself the hero. Then he structured the plot to leave the impression that the greatest of all earthly poets was, well, who else? Dante Alighieri. Now watch carefully as the Florentine wannabe makes the bunny of renown emerge from a hat. The Roman Virgil was widely acknowledged as the greatest poet who had ever lived, but Dante was a relative unknown. So Dante made Virgil his fictional guide through hell and purgatory, thus putting himself in Virgil's league. When the pair reached heaven, Virgil had to stay behind. Only Dante was allowed in. The implication that Dante picked up where Virgil had left off, and that the lad from Florence had transcended the old Roman entirely, This flagrant act of self-promotion worked. In fact, it snowballed. After he died, Florence promoted the theme of Dante as the world's greatest poet. Why? To promote Florence as a leading city of the arts and an all-around admirable town. The press has become the greatest power within the Western countries. More powerful than the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Hostile newspapers are more to be dreaded than 100,000 bayonets. Napoleon. The press leads the public. Japanese saying. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism in society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. Edward Bernays. We see what we're told is there, not what is. A 1989 survey showed that drug use and crime were on a par in the U.S. and Canada. But Americans ranked drugs as their number one problem and crime as their third. Canadians saw drugs as insignificant and ranked crime a lowly 20th on the list of their dilemmas. The facts were the same, but the perceptions were different. Why? Because the headlines in the two countries were different. Molly Ivins, a highly respected journalist who's worked for the New York Times, among other papers, wrote in the Houston Journalism Review, "You can find out more about what's going on at the state capitol by spending one night drinking with the Capitol Press Corps than you can in months of reading the papers those reporters write for." The same is true of City Hall reporters, court reporters, police reporters, education writers, any of us. In city rooms and in the bars where news people drink, you can find out what's going on. You can't find it in the papers. Then, there are the many cases in which the press manufactures or manipulates the news. According to the New York Times Book Review, Oliver North describes being in the office of the Reagan aide, Pat Buchanan, working on an announcement of the capture of the Achille Lauro terrorists, when Niles Latham, an editor at the New York Post, called to ask Mr. Buchanan to make the president say, "You can run, but you can't hide," so the paper could use it as a front page headline. Mr. Buchanan obligingly wrote the line into the president's remarks. From 1968 to 1988, the average length of a TV news soundbite allotted to a presidential candidate fell from 43 seconds to 9.8. Meanwhile, pictures of the candidates with none of his words tripled. This gave the TV producer nearly total power to reshape or distort a candidate's message. A 1990 survey showed that an astonishing number of congressmen and other elected officials believed that the pyramids may have been built by aliens. Even worse, one of the groups that came out with the highest levels of general ignorance were newspaper editors. Over 50% of these media leaders felt that dinosaurs and humans had inhabited the earth at the same time. Humans, in fact, didn't show up until some 65 million years after the dinosaurs had abandoned their bones and departed from the scene. The bottom line, the men and women spooning facts into the brains of most Americans have apparently gotten their scientific education from the Flintstones. Writes Molly Ivins. One of the most depressing aspects of reporters as a group is that they tend to be fairly ignorant themselves. There is no excuse for it, and there is a complete cure for it. Read, read, read. Further muddling the information we receive from overseas is the fact, reported by historian and former New York Times journalist Robert Darnton, that few foreign correspondents speak the language of the country they cover. So that's the fact. So-called foreign reporters simply regurgitate preconceptions. English correspondents write of the England of Dickens, and those in France portray the France of Victor Hugo, with some Maurice Chevalier thrown in. What justifies this, says Darnton? Newspaper stories must fit a culture's preconceptions of news. Newspaper stories must fit a culture's preconceptions of news. Anyone who's been interviewed by the press knows that his so-called quotes will be wild distortions of his original statements, yet writers refuse to check the accuracy of their notes with the source. Why? Says one former investigative reporter, we don't like to be confronted with our own mistakes. What's more, we are tired of the story and don't want to do more work. Wow. Writers respond to the world with the kind of herd instinct. They see which direction the animals on either side of them are rushing and don't bother to notice the real world through which the pack is moving. Pow. Yet they pretend to report on the real world. What's worse, they often fool their readers into believing that this is true. Fool. So I'm angry at the press. I am angry at its dishonesty. I am infuriated by its moral corruption. I am disgusted with its laziness and lack of intellectual independence. I am sickened by its phony self-image. I am furious that I was lied to in my youth. I hate the reporter for telling me about Chiang Kai-shek's atrocities while hiding Mao's. I hate the Village Voice for telling me about my lie without informing me that the standard Viet Cong procedure for winning the hearts and minds of villagers was to take the most prominent village family, usually a dozen or more grandparents, uncles, aunts, mothers, fathers, children, and infants, tie them to a few canisters of dynamite in the town square, then detonate the charge. I hate the press for turning me into a war protester against Nixon and Johnson when I should have been shouting just as loudly against Ho Chi Minh. And I am disconcerted that the tribe they have slated for the next Cambodian-style annihilation is my own. Today, I read 30 different publications, most of them obscure periodicals from both the left and right. I never want to be deceived again, and I don't want to see my own people victimized. Though I can't, for the hell of me, figure out how to stop it. I could give you numerous other examples from personal experience and subsequent research, but it's a long story and we'll have to wait for some other time. The surprising part is that just like Jonathan Swift, today's journalists regard themselves as not only the guardians of honesty, morality, and truth, but think they're incorruptible. Human nature is so peculiar. In fact, it's a bit worse than that. It's downright dangerous. And the press is among the most dangerous of all. When we see I see I've put you to sleep. But just remember, all you need is an automatic weapon and a sharp knife, and you too can use Yasser Arafat's keys to publicity success. If you handle them properly, the press will fall for anything, especially if it promises to spill a lot of blood. Damn, that's deep.